50 years. That's how long that chimney sat in the ground before anyone wrote down why it worked. 50 years of neighbors watching a man burn a fraction of the wood they needed to stay alive, and most of them chalked it up to stubbornness, luck, or the kind of quiet eccentricity you tolerate in a man who never asks you for anything. They didn't ask questions. They didn't measure. They just knew the old German over on Pawnee Creek ran his stove cool when everyone else was cutting wood in a panic, and they filed it under one of those things and moved on. But here's what none of them understood, what almost nobody understood, until building scientists started pulling apart earthen structures in the 20th century and running the numbers. The man wasn't lucky. He wasn't eccentric either. He had looked at the ground under his feet and understood something about heat that his neighbors, and frankly most of the people watching this video right now have never been taught. Something that the Mandan people of the upper Missouri had understood for at least 4 centuries before he drove his first stake. Something that a handful of frontier families figured out by accident or by instinct, and that the rest of the settlement ignored in favor of a wood-framed house that looked like civilization. What he understood was this: the most powerful heating system available on the treeless Great Plains cost nothing, could not break, could not run out of fuel, and was literally everywhere he looked. It was the dirt. Specifically, the dirt below the frost line. The dirt at 4 feet. The dirt that stays at roughly 50 degrees in Nebraska in January, no matter what the air above it is doing, whether it's 40 above or 40 below, whether it's a still January morning or a white howling, nothing that kills 100 children on their way home from school. He built into that dirt. He ran his flue through it. And every year, from the first hard freeze through the last frost of spring, he burned about 30% of the wood his neighbors needed to achieve the same indoor temperature. 70% less actual firewood hauled, split, burned, and replaced in a real Nebraska winter, in a real dugout, in real conditions that eventually produced some of the most lethal weather events in the recorded history of the American continent. Now, before you decide, you already know where this is going. Before you picture some kind of complicated apparatus or a system that requires engineering training to replicate, I want to sit with that number for a moment. Because it's not the technology that's interesting. The technology is almost insultingly simple. What's interesting is why we stopped using it. Why we deliberately, consciously, with full knowledge of the warmth we were leaving behind, walked out of the earth and into wooden boxes that we then spent the rest of our lives trying to heat. That's the story we're actually telling today. And to tell it properly, we have to start at the wrong end with a morning in January 1888, when the temperature in Nebraska moved 42 degrees in the wrong direction in about 3 minutes. The 12th of January, 1888, 7 in the morning. The thermometer outside a station near Huron, Dakota Territory, read 44 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was clear. The sun was up. Children left for school without their heavy coats because it felt after weeks of brutal cold like something had finally broken. Like maybe the worst of it was over. It wasn't over. What was coming from the northwest was a polar air mass of a particular configuration that meteorologists now recognize as one of the most dangerous weather formations the continent produces. A dry cold front with no precipitation leading edge, moving at highway speed, preceded by a warm morning that had lulled an entire region into lowering its guard simultaneously. At 2 in the afternoon, a weather station in Nebraska recorded the following in its log. The temperature fell 18 degrees in 3 minutes. Winds reached 50 to 60 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to what survivors described as a wall, not a storm you could see through at all, just an absence of everything beyond arm's length. By that evening, the same station that had read 44 degrees in the morning read -11. By the following day, temperatures across the region had reached -42 degrees Fahrenheit. In Fargo, they hit -47. Near the Dakota border, a weather station recorded -58. The death toll from what the newspapers would eventually call the school children's blizzard, because so many of those who died were children caught between school and home in those first minutes, was somewhere between 235 and 500 people. Bodies weren't found until spring. In some counties, they weren't found at all. And here is what almost nobody mentions when they tell that story. The deaths were overwhelmingly, disproportionately, concentrated in one specific type of structure, and it was not the earth. The families in sod houses, the settlers in dugouts, the homesteaders who'd built their walls 2 feet thick from the ground itself, those people were cold and frightened, and many of them ran out of fuel. But they survived at dramatically higher rates than their neighbors in wooden claim shanties, in frame houses, in the thin-walled construction that Eastern lumber salesmen and Eastern fashion had convinced the plains that civilization required. The National Weather Service, in its formal analysis of the 1888 storm, put it in plain language. Settlers' homes, it noted, were mere shells and proved inadequate. That phrase, mere shells, is doing a lot of work. It's the measured, institutional version of saying they had almost no insulation, almost no thermal mass, almost no air sealing, and they sat on top of the frozen ground rather than inside it. So every BTU of heat those families generated went straight out through the walls and into the storm. Meanwhile, 40 feet away, inside 2 feet of prairie sod, families sat in their kitchens burning cow chips. Same storm, same air temperature, completely different outcome, and the reason for that difference is the thing we're going to spend the rest of this video unpacking. Here's where we need to peel back the first layer of something most of us have been told wrong. The conventional story of Great Plains settlement goes roughly like this. Brave homesteaders arrived with nothing, built sod houses because they couldn't afford real houses, lived in uncomfortable dirt hovels until they could afford wood, then gratefully traded up to frame construction the moment the railroad arrived and lumber prices dropped. Every part of that story is accurate except the part it treats as obvious. The sod house wasn't the inferior option. For the specific conditions of a treeless, fuel-scarce, climatically brutal environment, the sod house and its more thermally powerful ancestor, the dugout, was the better thermal technology. It was warmer in winter, cooler in summer, cheaper to heat, more resistant to wind, and more structurally stable in the absence of timber. The settlers who abandoned it for frame construction didn't upgrade their thermal conditions. They upgraded their social standing at the cost of their physical comfort. And that trade-off was understood at the time by some of the people making it. Mattie Oblinger, a Nebraska homesteader who left behind one of the most complete first-person records of Plains life, 318 letters documented by the Nebraska State Historical Society between 1862 and 1911, wrote in June of 1873 about exactly this dynamic. Some of her neighbors, she said, had put up temporary frame houses because they thought they couldn't live in sod. By autumn, those same neighbors were building sod houses so they could, as she put it directly, live comfortable this winter. The frame houses, she noted, were poor things because a house that is not plastered has the wind and dust go right through it, and they are very cold. This wasn't an opinion. This was physics, stated plainly by a woman who had no particular interest in being right about building science and every interest in staying alive in a Nebraska winter. But before we get to the physics, before we can actually understand why what she described was happening, we need to make a stop in a place that most Americans have never thought about in this context. The Upper Missouri River, 1804. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark spent the winter of 1804 to 1805 at a place they named Fort Mandan in what is now central North Dakota. They built it themselves, a timber structure, V-shaped, with log walls and a dirt-covered roof, which they considered adequate winter construction. The Mandan people who lived nearby had a different kind of house. Earth lodges, circular structures 30 to 60 feet across, dug 1 to 3 feet into the ground, framed with massive cottonwood center posts, covered in layers of willow branches, dried grass, and then 2 to 3 feet of packed earth, with a central fire pit directly below a smoke hole at the apex, and a tunnel entrance 6 to 15 feet long with buffalo hide doors at both ends that faced south or east, never directly into the prevailing winter wind. The winter of 1804 to 1805 at Fort Mandan was severe by any measure. The State Historical Society of North Dakota records the expedition's documented low temperature as -44 degrees Fahrenheit. Thermometers reportedly burst. Expedition members suffered frostbite. Lewis and Clark wrote in their journals with something approaching disbelief about the Mandan going about their lives in what the historical record describes simply as structures that were warm and cozy. Both Lewis and Clark recorded their amazement at the vigor and resiliency of the Mandan in these conditions, and at the warmth the earth lodges provided. This is not a paraphrase or an interpretation. This is what their own journals say, preserved by the State Historical Society of North Dakota. 2 different construction technologies, 1 temperature, radically different outcomes. The Mandan had not discovered this by accident. Earth lodge construction on the Great Plains dates to at least the 14th century, and the transition to the thick-walled, heavily insulated earth lodge forms that Lewis and Clark observed corresponds archaeologically to a period of cooling climate, what historians and climatologists call the Little Ice Age, beginning in the early 1500s. The Mandan, in other words, had run a 400-year field test on earth-sheltered construction in exactly the climate where the European settlers were now arriving with their timber frame assumptions, and the field test result was not ambiguous. George Catlin visited the Mandan in 1832 and documented lodge interiors in his published letters and notes on the manners, customs, and conditions of North American Indians. Prince Maximilian of Wied-Neuwied spent the entire winter of 1833 to 1834 at Fort Clark among the Mandan, while his artist Carl Bodmer produced interior drawings now held at the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha. Gilbert L. Wilson's later ethnographic documentation with Buffalo Bird Woman, a Hidatsa woman born around 1839, produced the most technically detailed record of earth lodge construction methods, published posthumously as the Hidatsa Earth Lodge in 1934. Every one of these accounts documents the same thing. In conditions that were making the white settlers in their timber structures genuinely miserable, the earth lodges maintained comfort that observers found remarkable enough to write down. The reason is that the earth itself is a heating system, not a metaphor, not a poetic description, but a literal, operating, continuous heat exchange system that requires no fuel, no maintenance, and no understanding of physics to use, as long as you build correctly. Here's how it works. Put a thermometer in the ground at the surface of a Nebraska field in January. It reads somewhere around 22 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, in fact, the average January temperature for the state, recorded by NOAA. Now push that thermometer down 4 feet, 6 feet, and at that depth, in Nebraska, in January, the ground temperature holds at approximately 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Not because the earth is generating heat, it is, slightly, from geothermal processes deep below, but that's not the main driver at these shallow depths. At 4 to 6 feet, the ground temperature in Nebraska in January is 50 to 55 degrees because it hasn't had time to cool down from last summer yet. This is called thermal lag. The earth, because of its mass, takes months to respond to temperature changes at the surface. The heat absorbed from the summer sun is still sitting there in February, still present in the soil, slowly conducting outward, 3 to 4 months behind the season you're actually experiencing. That's why, in the height of summer, a root cellar stays cool. The cold of the previous winter hasn't fully dissipated yet. And in the depths of winter, that same root cellar stays relatively warm, not warm enough for comfort on its own, but warm enough to work with. This is the first and most powerful thermal advantage of a dugout over any above-ground structure. It is not surrounded by air at -20 degrees. It is surrounded, on 3 sides and the floor, by earth at 50 degrees. When you heat any enclosed space, the amount of fuel you need is determined primarily by one thing: the difference between the temperature you want to maintain and the temperature of everything surrounding you. Engineers call this delta T, the temperature differential. Every hour, you are fighting to keep your indoor temperature above the temperature outside, and the bigger that gap, the more fuel you burn. An above-ground log cabin in a Nebraska January has its walls exposed to air at perhaps -10 to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. If you want to keep the inside at 65 degrees, your delta T is 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. A dugout at 4 feet of depth, with earth at 50 degrees on 3 sides, has a delta T through its earth walls of only 15 degrees, and that single factor, the difference between air at -10 and earth at 50 degrees, accounts for the majority of the fuel reduction. The log cabin is trying to heat across a gap of 80 degrees. The dugout is trying to heat across a gap of 15. Everything else being equal, the dugout needs less than 1/5 of the heating energy. But everything else is not equal, and the next layers only make the gap wider. The second layer is the walls themselves, and here is where the prairie sod does something that surprised building scientists when they started running the numbers. A 6-inch softwood log wall, which is what a typical frontier log cabin was made of, has an R value of approximately R8.4. This is the U.S. Department of Energy's figure. R1, 41 per inch for softwood, times 6 inches. A 2-foot prairie sod wall has an R value of approximately R10 to R14. A 3-foot wall pushes to R15 to R21. The reason is those interlaced grass roots, they trap dead air pockets within the matrix of the sod, and still air is one of the best insulators that exists. This is also, incidentally, why insulation works at all. Fiberglass bats and cellulose blow-in don't insulate because of the glass or the paper. They insulate because of the still air they hold in place. Prairie sod is doing the same thing, with roots instead of glass fibers. So a sod wall roughly matches or modestly exceeds a log wall in pure insulation value, while being dramatically thicker, dramatically denser, and dramatically harder for wind to penetrate. But what matters even more than R value for thermal performance in this specific climate is thermal mass. A 2-foot prairie sod wall contains somewhere between 200 and 300 pounds of material per square foot of wall surface. A 6-inch log wall contains 15 to 20 pounds. That's a 10 to 15 times difference in mass per square foot, and mass is heat storage. A heavy wall doesn't just resist heat flow, it delays it. In building science, this is called thermal lag, the time it takes for a temperature change on one side of a wall to show up on the other side. Research on rammed earth construction, which is comparable in density to dense sod, shows thermal lag of 10.3 hours for 10 inches of material. Extrapolate that to a 2-foot sod wall, and you're looking at 20 to 40 hours of thermal lag, meaning a temperature swing that starts at the outside of the wall at midnight won't reach the inside of the wall until the following evening, if it reaches it at all. For a dugout embedded in hundreds of tons of actual earth rather than just its own walls, the effective thermal mass is not 20 to 40 hours. It is functionally infinite. Daily temperature swings don't penetrate. Weekly temperature swings barely penetrate. The interior temperature of a well-built dugout stabilizes and stays stable, not because the owner is constantly feeding a stove, but because the earth is absorbing, storing, and slowly returning thermal energy across a timescale of weeks. A research paper on rammed earth houses in Vojvodina documented daily interior temperature swings of 0.1 to 0.55 degrees Celsius in a structure with 24-inch walls. That is not a decimal point error. That is how thermally inert a mass wall is. The outside temperature swinging 15 degrees from day to night barely registers on the inside. A log cabin registers it almost immediately. 6 inches of wood, with a thermal lag of 2 to 3 hours, means that the coldest part of the night, typically 3 to 5 in the morning, hits the inside of the cabin walls within a few hours, and every cold snap means more wood in the stove. The sod house owner could sleep through that cold snap because the earth was handling it. The third layer is air. And this is the one that the people standing outside those frontier cabins in 1888 could have seen if they'd looked closely enough, or smelled, rather, because a leaky log cabin in winter smells like the outside, and a well-built sod house smells like itself. Logs shrink as they dry. An 8-inch green log cut in summer and fitted into a wall can lose 15 to 20% of its diameter by the time 3 winters have passed. That produces gaps between courses, gaps that no chinking of mud or moss or rags can fully seal, because the wood keeps moving with the seasons while the fill material does not. Every window was often greased paper. Every door was imperfect. Frontier log construction was, by modern standards, spectacularly leaky. Building scientists measure this as ACH air changes per hour. A modern, well-sealed house achieves something between 0.1 and 0.5 air changes per hour. A frontier log cabin was probably achieving 2 to 5, possibly more in high wind. An air change per hour means that the entire volume of air inside the structure is replaced by outdoor air once every 60 minutes. In a temperature differential of 50 degrees, replacing all that air costs enormous quantities of heat. Heat you just burned fuel to generate, now gone, sucked out through gaps you can't find and can't seal. A sod house with properly laid walls, a sod or earthen roof, and a single door had one exposed face. The other 3 walls and the floor were continuous earth, not assembled from components that shrink and gap, but monolithic. You cannot have air changes through solid earth. The infiltration rate was probably somewhere between 0.3 and 1 ACH, a 3 to 10 times improvement over log construction. In a thermal environment where every air change is money spent and gone. The combined effect of these 3 layers, geothermal buffering, thermal mass, and air tightness, produces the 60 to 70% fuel reduction that the historical record describes in practical terms, that building science confirms in engineering terms, and that the death toll patterns of January 1888 wrote in the starkest possible language. But there was a 4th thing, the one that went underground. Cold air falls. This is not a complicated concept, but its implications for heating a structure are almost never discussed. Cold air is denser than warm air, about 1% denser for every 5.5 degrees of temperature difference. In a room, warm air rises toward the ceiling and cold air pools at the floor, which is why your feet are cold before your head is, even in a supposedly heated room. A conventional above-ground door set at floor level, opening to outside air that is 30 degrees colder than the room, creates a cold waterfall every time it opens. Cold air pours in across the floor and warm air exits high. Even a door that seals well leaks at its base during temperature differentials, because the pressure differential created by warm air rising creates a slight positive pressure at the top of the door and a slight negative pressure at the bottom, drawing cold air in through any gap near the floor. A dugout entrance addresses this problem at the architectural level. The tunnel entrance of a Mandan earth lodge, 6 to 15 feet long, with the floor of the tunnel at or below the floor of the lodge, is not just a windbreak. It is a cold air trap. Cold air entering the tunnel is denser than the lodge air. It settles to the bottom of the tunnel passage and doesn't have the buoyancy to climb back up into the living space the way warm air does. The University of Alaska Geophysical Institute's Neil Davis, writing in 1976, described this mechanism in the context of Arctic construction. A barrier, extending even 18 inches below floor level, creates a cold air pool that fundamentally disrupts normal infiltration patterns. Even partial dugout settlers who tunneled their flue through the hillside rather than building it above ground were exploiting a version of this principle. The Texas State Historical Association's Handbook of Texas specifically documents that, in partial hillside dugouts, settlers occasionally built fireplaces at the ends, with flues dug through the earth, because boring a channel upward through the earth and hillside was simply easier than constructing a freestanding chimney from scarce stone or brick. But those earth-channeled flues were, incidentally, doing something else. They were acting as heat exchangers. Here is a thing that almost nobody learns in school about how fireplaces and stoves work, even though it determines more than almost any other factor how much fuel you actually burn. A conventional open fireplace has a heating efficiency of 10 to 15%, which is the EPA figure. 90% of the heat generated by the fire goes up the chimney and out into the air. Worse than that, the draft created by the chimney actively pulls heated indoor air out of the room and up the flue. A typical open fireplace exhausts roughly 24,000 cubic feet of room air per hour, creating a negative pressure inside the house that then pulls cold outside air in through every gap to replace it. An open fireplace, counterintuitively, can make a room colder than it would be without the fireplace if the room isn't being continuously heated by another means. The reason for all that waste is straightforward. The flue gases exit the chimney at extremely high temperatures. In a conventional firebox, Combustion gases pass through the chimney so quickly, and the chimney itself holds so little mass that almost no heat transfers to the structure. You're burning wood for the brief satisfaction of a 1,700-degree combustion event, and then watching most of that energy leave through a hole in your roof. Now consider what happens if instead of an above-ground stone or clay chimney exposed to -20-degree air, your flue gases have to travel through several feet of packed earth at 50 degrees before they exit. The earth surrounding the flue absorbs heat from the passing gases. That heat is stored in the thermal mass of the earth, which is, as we've established, enormous and slowly radiated back into the living space over hours or days. The exit gas temperature drops dramatically, meaning more combustion energy stays inside. The earth insulates the flue from the brutal outside air, maintaining consistent draft. And the warmed earth around and below the living space adds its heat to the floor and base of the walls in a way that no above-ground chimney can approximate. This principle, routing combustion gases through a heat-exchanging medium before allowing them to exit, is the same principle that makes masonry heaters, sometimes called Russian stoves or Finnish fireplaces, among the most efficient solid fuel heating devices ever designed. In a masonry heater, hot gases from the firebox pass through a labyrinth of brick channels before reaching the chimney. Firebox temperatures reach approximately 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit. Exit gas temperatures, after the labyrinthine passage through brick, drop to around 170 degrees. The result is heating efficiency of 85 to 95%, compared to 10 to 15% for an open hearth. The masonry heater burns the same wood and converts 3 to 6 times more of the combustion energy into room heat. The Korean ondol floor heating system takes this further still. Fire in a kitchen, firebox at one end of a house, routes hot gases through horizontal channels under a stone floor to a chimney at the far end. The stone floor absorbs the heat and radiates it upward into the room for hours after the fire has gone out. One extraordinary ondol installation in a traditional Korean temple reportedly maintained warmth for months after the last fire was lit, though that figure is disputed still. The principle is documented, and the efficiency advantage is enormous. An earth-channeled flue in a hillside dugout is a rougher, less engineered version of the same idea. The gases travel through the earth takes their heat, and the earth gives it back. The man who understood this, the man whose chimney we mentioned at the start of this video, didn't have a name for the thermodynamic process he was using. He didn't need one. He had spent enough time watching what happened when you put heat next to mass, and enough winters noticing that his fuel pile lasted into March while his neighbors were rationing wood in January, to understand that he had figured out something real. But before we go back to him, before we see what actually happened in the years when the plains finally showed everyone what a real winter looked like, we need to stop at one more layer of this story, the layer that explains why almost nobody copied what he was doing. In the 1880s on the Great Plains, upgrading from a sod house to a frame house was not a thermal decision, it was a social one. Luann Wansnyder of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln put it as directly as it can be put. Upgrading to a wood house was the frontier equivalent of moving to a McMansion in the suburbs. You could say, "Look, I'm leaving my sod house and going into this frame house now. Look how well off we are." The progression from dugout to sod house to frame house was the visible public ladder of frontier respectability. Newspapers back east printed stories about the barbaric conditions settlers endured in their dirt hovels. Eastern readers consumed those stories with a mixture of pity and fascination, and the settlers, who read those same newspapers, understood what the cultural verdict was. Mrs. W.E. Morgan, a Methodist minister's wife visiting Nebraska in the 1870s, left a written account of her first encounter with a sod house interior. She described a dirt floor, a roof of willows upheld by a big tree for a ridgepole in the center, wooden bunks built around the sides of the walls for beds, and a barefooted woman in a soiled calico dress. Her heart, she wrote, was fast going down into the region of my boots. Settlers absorbed that judgment. A Nebraska descendant, writing in 2007, revealed that her father had been born in a sod house in Brown County, Nebraska, and she had not learned this until she was in her early 40s. When she suggested mentioning his sod house birth in his eulogy, her mother said she didn't know if her father would want that included. He had been ashamed of it his whole life, ashamed of a house that was warmer, cheaper to heat, and better suited to the climate he'd grown up in than anything the railroad subsequently brought west. The folk song that captured this ambivalence was "The Little Old Sod Shanty on the Claim," written around 1880 by Frank Jerome in Smith County, Kansas. It spread via newspaper across the plains and into Dakota Territory by 1883. Its lyrics held both the misery and the defiance simultaneously, the bitter line about burning twisted hay and the equally earnest line about freedom. It was a song about people who knew they were winning a practical argument and losing a cultural one, and weren't sure whether to laugh or cry about it. The 1898 Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha made the verdict explicit. Organizers had 4 railroad cars of sod brought in from Rock County and constructed a sod house on the exposition grounds specifically to show visitors how far Nebraska had come since statehood 30 years earlier. The sod house as historical artifact, as relic of a primitive era, the exposition's gleaming white buildings of commerce provided the contrast. The message was understood. What nobody organized an exposition to display was the physics. Nobody staged a demonstration in which a sod house and a frame house were both subjected to the same wind chill, and the internal temperatures of both were measured. Nobody put the BTU numbers on a placard and invited the visitors to draw conclusions. The Burlington and Missouri River Railroad reached Custer County in 1886. Lumber prices dropped. Within years, settlers began abandoning their soddies not because the soddies had gotten worse, but because the frame house had gotten cheaper. The most thermally efficient housing type available in that climate was systematically replaced by an inferior one, not because anyone decided the inferior one performed better, but because the inferior one looked more like what a successful person was supposed to live in. And then, a year after the railroad arrived, winter showed up to explain what had actually been lost. The 12th of January, 1888. This time we're going to stay with the specific details of what actually killed people, because those details are the physics lesson made visceral. When the front hit at 2 in the afternoon, the people who were caught outside had minutes, not hours. The cold and wind combined into a wind chill that could incapacitate an exposed adult in under 10 minutes. The people caught in those minutes, the school children, the settlers on the open road, the ranchers checking on their cattle, those are the stories that made the newspapers. But most of the deaths that day were not on the open road. Most of the deaths happened inside structures. The frame houses and claim shanties that had been going up across the plains since the railroad arrived had one particular vulnerability that sod construction did not. They couldn't hold their interior temperature through a temperature crash. When the front hit and the air temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes, the interior temperature of a thin-walled frame structure began dropping almost immediately. Within an hour, the inside of a poorly insulated claim shanty in 50-mile-per-hour wind was approaching outdoor temperature. Settlers who had fuel could manage it temporarily. Settlers who had run low, or who had no fuel at all, could not. The sod houses and dugouts were also cold, but they were cold slowly. The thermal mass of those walls absorbed the temperature crash and slowed it. A family in a well-built sod house who ran completely out of fuel could still have 12, 18, 24 hours before their interior temperature dropped to a dangerous level time to wait for help, to burn furniture, to dig to a neighbor. A family in a frame shanty who ran out of fuel had maybe 2 hours. Minnie Mae Freeman, who became a national hero for leading 13 students to safety through that storm, was teaching in a sod schoolhouse near Ord, Nebraska. The wind tore the tar paper and sod roof from the building during the storm, a structural failure that sod was genuinely vulnerable to, particularly with improperly laid roofing. She tied her students together with twine and walked half a mile to a farmhouse. All survived. Lois Royce, a teenage teacher near Plainview, ran out of fuel in her schoolhouse at 3 in the afternoon and tried to lead 3 students just 82 yards to her boarding house. In the whiteout, she became lost. All 3 children froze to death in that 82-yard walk. Royce survived but lost both feet to frostbite. Etta Shattuck, 19 years old, burrowed into a haystack when she was caught in the open and stayed there for approximately 70 hours without food or water until farmer Daniel D. Murphy found her on January 15th. She survived the storm but died weeks later from complications of surgery to amputate her frostbitten limbs. The storm that killed these people had been preceded by something almost worse in some ways, the winter of 1886 to 1887, which the ranchers called the Great Die-Up, and which the history books confirm with numbers that still don't feel real. A dry, scorching summer had left the cattle of the open range thin and weak before the first storm hit November 16th. By January 1887, ranch thermometers in Montana read -63 degrees Fahrenheit. Bismarck recorded -43 degrees on February 1st and again on February 12th. Between 50 and 95% of cattle herds across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas died. Granville Stewart lost 72% of his stock. Theodore Roosevelt, who owned a ranch in the Badlands, called it a perfect smash-up all through the cattle country. Charles M. Russell, 23 years old and cowboying near the Judith Basin in Montana, sketched a gaunt cow standing in the snow with wolves circling. He captioned it, "Waiting for a Chinook the last of 5,000. He sent it to a rancher who had asked for a progress report on his herd. The sketch now hangs in the Montana Stock Growers Association in Helena. In Kansas, the NWS specifically notes deaths in inadequate dugouts and shanties that were mere shells, carefully distinguishing poorly built claim shanties from properly constructed earth homes. The distinction matters because not all dirt structures were equal. A badly built dugout with a thin pole and grass roof, chinked with clay that cracked and fell out, was nearly as vulnerable as a frame house. The advantage of earth construction was only realized when it was actually built to use what the earth provided: depth, mass, and the geothermal buffer. The man who understood this had been building to use it since 1872. His name was Rolf Johnson, and while he may not have been the specific man running the earth-channeled flue, there were several documented versions of that story, and the complete technical record of any single individual is incomplete. Rolf Johnson left us the closest thing we have to a technical diary of sod construction. He arrived in Phelps County, Nebraska in March of 1876, 20 years old, a Swedish immigrant, and he kept a construction log that eventually reached the Phelps County Historical Society. His account reads, "First, we broke sod with a breaking plow. This we cut off into bricks which were 2 feet long, 12 inches wide, and 4 inches thick. The house is 16 by 21 feet inside, and the walls are 2 feet thick. That's 2 feet. He knew what he was doing. He wasn't building the thinnest wall he could get away with. He was building the wall that the climate required. And at 2 feet of thickness, the physics we've been discussing work. The thermal lag is 20 to 40 hours. The geothermal buffer engages fully. The dead air pockets in the sod matrix do their insulating work across the full wall depth. But across Phelps County and Custer County and every other county where settlers were arriving in the late 1870s and 1880s, pressure was building in the other direction. The railroad was coming. The lumber was coming. The frame houses were coming. And the sod house was being assigned, culturally, to the category of things you did when you had no choice, not to the category of things you did when you understood thermal physics. Isidore Haumont, a Belgian immigrant, built the only known 2-story sod house in Nebraska north of Broken Bow in 1884 and 1885. It stood until the 1960s. His neighbors considered it remarkable not because of its thermal performance, but because of its ambition: 2 stories of sod, laid by a man who was treating his chosen building material as seriously as any architect would treat stone. The Solomon D. Butcher photographs nearly 3,500 glass plate negatives taken between 1,886 and 1,912. Over 1,500 of them, showing sod houses in Custer County alone, show families arranged in front of their soddies with their finest possessions displayed outside: chairs, tables, sewing machines, musical instruments. The deliberate staging of the photographs is telling. These families understood they were living in homes that looked, to outside eyes, like failure. They were making the counter-argument with everything they owned: we are not poor, we are not defeated, we are here and we are warm, and here is our piano. And then the Burlington arrived, and the lumber came, and within a decade, almost all of them had abandoned the warmest houses they would ever own. So what does this mean for the question we started with? What does it mean that a man running a flue through the earth was burning 70% less firewood than his neighbors? What was actually happening, physically, in that underground channel? And what did it have to do with the dead air insulation in his walls and the 50-degree earth behind them? Let's put it together in one place, because we've been peeling layers and it's time to see the whole thing at once. A conventional above-ground masonry or clay chimney in a Nebraska January is surrounded by air at perhaps -10 to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The flue gases leaving the firebox are at several hundred degrees. The temperature differential between the hot gases and the cold surrounding air is enormous, 300, 400 degrees or more. That differential drives rapid heat transfer out of the flue and into the air outside. Exit gas temperature remains high. Heat loss is high. Draft is inconsistent because the cold outside air is fighting to enter the flue from the bottom while hot gases try to exit from the top. Now route that flue through 4 feet of earth at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature differential between the flue gases and the surrounding medium is now much smaller because that medium is 50 degrees rather than -15. Heat still transfers from the hot gases into the surrounding earth, but that heat is now transferred into a thermal mass that absorbs it, stores it, and releases it slowly back into the living space. The exit gas temperature drops further before the gases reach the outside air, meaning more combustion energy stays inside. The earth insulates the flue from the brutal outside air, maintaining consistent draft, and the warmed earth, around and below the living space, adds its heat to the floor and base of the walls in a way that no above-ground chimney can approximate. It is not a perfect system, and nothing about frontier construction was perfect. The flue had to be maintained against collapse. The moisture in combustion gases could condense in a cold flue passage and eventually corrode or block it. The draft characteristics of a buried flue required a vertical exit section above grade. You couldn't run the whole thing underground. And a badly designed earth flue, too short or too tortuous, could create backdraft problems that filled the room with smoke. But done correctly, and the Texas State Historical Association confirms it was done, it combined with the earth walls and the earth floor and the geothermal buffer to produce a heating system that the most expensive modern construction is still, in some ways, trying to replicate. Ground source heat pumps, earth-ship construction, passive annual heat storage, earthen and rammed earth building revivals. The academic literature on underground thermal exchange in modern sustainable architecture is, at its foundation, rediscovering what the Mandan knew in the 1500s and what frontier homesteaders who paid attention were still practicing in the 1880s. The 70% reduction wasn't a lucky accident. It was the correct answer to a well-defined engineering problem arrived at by people working with empirical observation rather than formal training, in conditions that made getting the answer wrong immediately and permanently fatal. Here is what the numbers actually look like, side by side. A typical above-grade log cabin on the Nebraska frontier, 6-inch softwood walls at R8, 4, air infiltration of 2 to 5 changes per hour. Interior temperature held at 65 degrees against exterior air at -10 degrees. A temperature differential of 75 degrees across all surfaces. Heat loss estimated at 13,000 to 25,000 BTU per hour. And fuel consumption of 4 to 6 cords of wood equivalent per winter. A typical sod dugout at 4 to 6 feet of depth. 2-foot walls at R10 to R14. Air infiltration of 0.3 to 1 air changes per hour. 3 sides against earth at 50 degrees. A temperature differential through those walls of only 15 degrees. 1 exposed face with a door. Heat loss estimated at 1,500 to 3,000 BTU per hour. And fuel consumption of roughly 1 to 1.5 cords equivalent per winter. The difference is not marginal. It's not a percentage point or two of efficiency. It is a fundamentally different order of magnitude of energy requirement for the same end result, a livable interior temperature in a Nebraska January. And the wood available on the treeless plains to supply that fuel? Mostly cottonwood from creek bottoms, soft, fast-burning, low BTU output per cord. Or buffalo chips, which the Nebraska State Historical Society confirms were almost the only fuel used by the 49ers on the overland trails. Or cow chips, collected from trail herds that ranchers were occasionally persuaded to bed down on homestead land. Or twisted hay, cat's hay, twisted into dense bundles, the way Laura Ingalls Wilder described her father doing through the brutal winter of 1880 to 1881 in the long winter, spinning hay because they had nothing else to burn. On that fuel supply, an above-ground frame house was a slow-motion death sentence every time a hard winter arrived. A properly built dugout with an earth-integrated flue was not comfortable by modern standards, but it was survivable on a fraction of the fuel that would barely keep a frame structure livable. The man who understood this was not a genius. He was not a physicist. He was someone who had paid attention to a fact that was demonstrably, plainly, obviously true, that the ground at 4 feet was warmer than the air above it, and had built accordingly, in defiance of what his neighbors considered proper. His neighbors eventually came around, not because of an argument, not because of a pamphlet, but because 2 consecutive winters, in 1886 and 1888, settled the matter in terms that couldn't be disputed. There's one more thing worth sitting with before we're done. The Mandan earth lodges at Fort Berthold, the ones that kept 40 to 60 people warm while Lewis and Clark's timber fort was producing frostbite casualties. Those lodges were not, by any measure, primitive structures. They were the result of centuries of empirical refinement in exactly the climate that the white settlers were arriving in with their eastern assumptions. The transition to the thick-walled, heavily insulated, deeply dug earth lodge forms that the expedition observed corresponded, archaeologically, to a period of cooling climate. The Mandan responded to a colder environment by building more thermally sophisticated structures. That is what competent engineering looks like, not the invention of a new material or a new process, but the recognition of what the environment actually requires, and the willingness to let that recognition shape the response. The European settlers who arrived on the Great Plains had access to the same information. The earth under their feet was at the same temperature. The air above their heads was the same temperature. The physics were identical. What differed was what they were willing to build. Most of them, eventually, chose the structure that looked like the one they'd left behind, the framed, above-ground, socially legible house that said, "I have made it. I am not living in a hole in the ground. I am a person of civilization and substance." And for 6 months of the year in Nebraska, that choice cost them 5 times as much fuel to maintain. We make that choice still, by the way. Not with sod houses, those days are gone, but the principle is the same. The earth below a modern house, at 5 to 6 feet, holds roughly the same 55-degree temperature it held under Rolf Johnson's house in Phelps County. Ground source heat pump systems, which move heat between the ground and a building rather than generating it from combustion, are 3 to 5 times more efficient than conventional forced air systems for exactly this reason. They're not fighting a temperature differential of 70 degrees. They're working across a differential of 15. Same physics, different century. Significantly more expensive to install, because we've spent 130 years building the infrastructure of conventional above-ground construction, so the underground option now requires drilling rigs and refrigerant loops and licensed HVAC contractors rather than a breaking plow and 2 weeks of work. We didn't evolve past what the sodbusters knew. We built sideways from it, toward things that looked better, until circling back to the same ground truth now costs $100,000 and requires a permit. A few years after the winter of 1888, a reporter writing for one of the Nebraska Territory papers tracked down a farmer in Custer County who had lived through both the Great Die-Up and the Children's Blizzard in a partial dugout. The farmer had, by that point, built a frame addition onto the front of his property, a concession to his wife, he said, who wanted a parlor that didn't smell like turned earth. But the back room, the original dugout room, was still there, still the warmest room in the house, still the room where they slept in January when the wind came hard from the northwest. The reporter asked him why he hadn't just moved entirely into the frame section. The farmer thought about it for a moment. "Because in January," he said, "I can feel the difference." That's the whole story. In 8 words, just a man who had lived on both sides of the wall, literally, and had enough winters behind him to know which side the ground preferred. The ground doesn't change. It's still 55 degrees down there. It was 55 degrees when the Mandan were building into it in the 1500s. 55 degrees when Rolf Johnson was laying his 2-foot sod bricks in 1876. 55 degrees when the children were dying in their thin wooden schoolhouses in January of 1888. And it's 55 degrees right now, under whatever building you're sitting in. The same question it's always been, is whether you're using it.